So, spoiler alert, this is not a machine learning or AI topic, but I hope it'll be a nice little dessert before pizza after those great presentations. So I'm here to talk about test bankruptcy and a little more about what I mean by that later. What I'd like to do is kind of tell a story about a great team that I worked with that got stuck in one particular area. We did lots of great things, but in this particular area we faltered, and it took a while to dig ourselves out of the hole. And to some of you, the specifics of the problem we had and how we fixed it might be interesting. I think more generally, though, I think the main thing is to look at how engineering teams can end up stuck like that, and what we can do to identify that situation and get out of it more quickly. So that's what I've taken from it, from the experience, and I'll try to share it with you. So just quickly, a little bit about me. It was already mentioned I work at Quovo. I'm a VP engineering there, actually. CTO at Slice before that. And then Intent Media, I worked for 6 years and ended up as VP engineering there as well. Now, I'm sorry to give you my resume. The point I mentioned it because actually the story I'm going to tell took place at Intent. And it's been very helpful for me since then. So that's the background there. So when I joined Intent, I was really, really happy to join this team. I loved their approach, their culture, and one of the things that really attracted me was their approach toward testing. And they were very, very, I had done a fair amount of TDD and a lot of unit testing. It was a little more rigorous at Intent, and I was really, really excited by it. This was the graphic that I didn't just pull up for this presentation. This was actually printed out and posted on the wall by the engineers there, presumably mocking those who did not have great test suites like we had. So the story really begins at my first retrospective there, and we did this typical, what went well, what could have gone better, and I was charmed to see that in the what went well section somebody had put my name there. Of course, it was just a gesture of welcome to the new guy, not an actual. It didn't really mean anything, but still, it was nice to see. It could have been on the other side, on the what didn't go well, so I was happy to see it there. On the what didn't go well section was a card that said the build. And when we voted on what to talk about, that got the most votes. And what it was referring to was the build taking too long, the test suite being too flaky, and that was the issue we were to discuss. So one of the engineers, a guy named Paul, was the first to speak. I was really glad to see this as a topic because having been there for a few weeks, I'd noticed that the build seemed a little slow, and yeah, it did seem to be flaky. It seemed to be red a lot more than what I was used to, where I'd come from. The build would fail every now and then, but someone would just raise their hand and say, sorry, my bad. They'd fix it, and we'd be back in business. Here it seemed, like it maybe wasn't in great shape, so I was glad we're talking about it. So Paul was the first to speak, and he said, folks, every retro we have, we put up a card that says the build. We vote for it, we talk about it, yada, 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 and then we don't do anything. And he said, so can we just stop putting this card up and stop talking about this? Because if we really actually cared about this, we would have done something by now. That was not where I expected him to go with that comment. Someone else replied, well, sure, we could, but if the build keeps getting longer and longer, it's going to take an hour, sooner or later. And that got scoffed at a little bit. And finally, one of the other engineers, one of the more senior guys said, look, I think our build's really solid. And my plan as the new guy had been just to quietly listen and learn, see what was going on here. But I got really caught up in the conversation, and this word slipped out of my mouth. I said, well, if it's solid, do you think it's green right now? And as soon as I said it, I realized I was being a jerk, and I felt really bad. Everybody turned and looked at me, and Pete, one of the other engineers, took that card off the wall, held it up, ripped it in half, and threw the pieces in the air. So if you're wondering why I can remember the details of a retro from like 6 years ago, that's why. I won't forget it ever, basically. It was, I didn't feel great about that. So fast forward a year, and the build takes an hour. So the prediction came true. It was not only that it took too long, but it was hard to run locally. So people would just push up to run it on the CI system, which would back up the queue there, and it took longer and longer. It developed into a real problem that no one could deny. And so the company, attacked it and moved into what I refer to as the era of optimization, where we tried to improve these tests, make them not flaky, make them run faster, and work really hard at it and focus at it. And I refer to it as the era because it was over a very long period of time where we attempted to resolve this problem. It culminated in this project that we actually called the 30-minute build project, which is sad to think that the goal of this, we put together a team of 3 full-time engineers to try to fix this problem, and the goal was to get the build down to 30 minutes, which today is a little depressing to think about, but they dug in, they did a bunch of stuff. The build was running on local hardware. They pushed the CI system out into AWS, auto-scaled, so it was running 20, 30 servers at a time, concurrently running tests. They did a bunch of great work, and they got the build times down, but it was rough going. And eventually they came back to the team as a whole and said, look, we're not going to solve this problem just this way. We need all of you to dive in and improve the quality of this test suite and change the way we think about it. And they pointed out there is this image of the testing pyramid, which many of you probably are familiar with. The idea on the left is the ideal, where there's a strong base of unit tests that run fast and are reliable, and then in the middle you have some amount of maybe component or service level testing. And at the top you just have a few end-to-end tests, because those ones are really expensive and hard to keep from being flaky. And that's the model. And they asserted that our pyramid was inverted, like the one on the right, which was true, basically, at least in terms of the run time. The time that spent running these end-to-end integration tests was tremendous, and we had to dig in. So they called upon all of us to improve how we did them, slim them down, optimize them, and not test every little thing end to end. And so we went about it, but we still struggled. We still struggled, and it was a pain point for a long time. So meanwhile, trouble was brewing elsewhere. Our release process was also getting long. So keep in mind that as we're doing this, we're hiring new engineers. The product's going really well, and many things are going. By the way, this team was doing great things. I'm pointing out something that didn't go well, but disclaimer, I just want to be sure to say that it's a really strong team, even though I'm talking about something that was less than ideal. We had a handful of services that we'd built from the get-go, but the process was to release them all together. And the advantage there was that you would, if you had to build a feature, you would make changes wherever you needed to make them in different services. Maybe there's a database migration. You would make all those changes and run the tests against them, this big test suite, and then release it all together. And you'd have confidence that what you had built worked and was safe to release. We really, at this point though, releasing like 7 different services all at once had become too much. The release process now took close to an hour sometimes, and it became flaky. So that maybe when you're working on service number 4 of them, a server wouldn't spin down or wouldn't come back up. And when we get half released, there are only a few people in the company that can dig us out of that hole. So it just became unwieldy. So we pushed that to releasing the services independently, and that required a change of mindset a little bit, or a lot, to think that you would release one. If you had a feature that involved multiple services, you'd have to make non-breaking changes to one service, release it, and then make your changes to the other service that might consume those new changes. That seemed scary and complicated to the team, and there was a fair amount of resistance. What we found, though, was that when we did it, there was actually no problem. We were able to make that switch in our minds. People didn't make mistakes, and the release became very fast. And we found out there were a lot of surprises. For example, there were some services that we released very, very rarely because they just didn't change very often. There were other services that we released multiple times a day because they changed frequently. And we had been releasing them all every single time. So in many cases, we realized after the fact that we'd be spinning down a bunch of servers, pulling the same code base and spinning it back up for no reason at all. It was a complete waste. So things actually sped up quite a bit, and this really helped us out a lot. It also kind of brought more focus to the test suite, again, because now I'm making one small change to one service, and I have to run this entire and very flaky end-to-end test suite, and people became grumpy about that. So, for example, you're just trying to change the color of a button in the UI, and you're running a huge test suite which takes a long time to run, and a flaky test that has nothing to do with what you're doing fails. It's very frustrating. So this brought us around to the place where we started to think about test bankruptcy. So the idea is that a flaky test suite is tech debt. In the same, debt has this problem, as you all know, that it's hard to pay back the interest, forget the principal. So we were definitely in a hole where we were unable, or had been unable, to pay down the interest, and we were really, really suffering. And for us, what bankruptcy meant, test bankruptcy, it meant basically turning off that test suite entirely, just cutting it out and moving on without it. So that was a move that was very much in opposition to the culture that I'd started the company, that had been already in the company when I started. And it was a hard switch to make, but at this point, we had suffered for a long time. We were talking about years at this point. It was, to me, at this point, I had the role of VP engineering, and I took it upon myself to just take this step. So I had to do two things. I had to get buy-in, and I had to basically take the responsibility for the decision. Getting buy-in turned out to be incredibly easy. Intent is an ad tech company. They're not tremendously risk-averse. They want what the business wanted, what the execs wanted, was speed, responsiveness from the engineering team. And I said to them, this will speed us up dramatically. There's a risk, their defect rate will be impacted. And the answer was, okay, we're willing to take that risk. So buy-in was really very easy. Of course, the engineers were all on board, as long as I was willing to get up, which I did, in front of the whole team and say, here's what we're doing, here's why, and if it goes bad, it's on me. That was all that it really took, and they were like, yes, let's do it. So you may be wondering what happened. We turned off that whole suite. I really thought it was a good choice. I thought the trade-offs were in our favor. What I found that was really a surprise was that there were no downsides whatsoever. Our defect rate didn't tick up even momentarily. The suite wasn't really protecting us much at all, and our increased speed enabled us to actually be much more stable and much more effective. So just quickly along those lines, I think you probably are familiar with this idea that pre-release, you can't get 100% confidence that your code has no issues, right? You'd like to, but you can't. So you can get, these numbers are made up, by the way, but you can get to 80% confidence very quickly. After that, it becomes harder and harder, and you never get to 100% confidence, right? You as a company, as a team, have to kind of find where you want to cut yourself off on that line. An ad tech company like Intent Media might try to move faster than NASA would, where for Intent Media, the risk was that people might not see ads for 2 minutes, and the risk for NASA obviously would be much greater. So you have to choose. And if you take it as a given that you can't have 100% confidence, then you have to take it as a given that you need production monitoring. And if you have production monitoring, you have effectively release monitoring. So Intent did a great job building some tools so that it was very easy when you release changes to just glance up and see if something went wrong, right? This is a mock-up, basically what was built around our front-end code. So you'd release JavaScript. It would take a while to spread out across the internets. But what you see here is the red line indicates the old version of the JavaScript falling out, and the orange line is the new version falling in, and the top line is the sum. And you could see that the release went out, without a problem. You could also see when it was fully in place, so you could expect whatever new feature you added to be there. This amounted to, some would say, that testing in production, if we go back to that original graphic. And, and I'm willing to own that I think you have to test in production to some extent. The only question is how much. And there's a natural, instinct for us to say we want to produce high quality, and therefore we're not going to release low quality code. We're going to do everything we can. I don't think we should do everything we can. I think we should be smart and make the right choices. If we have a fast release process, if you see there's a graph like this tank, and you can, literally in 30 seconds spin back the old version, or if, because your release only has one line of code changed in it, you know exactly what to do to fix it, you can respond quickly. Suddenly, spending weeks trying to test something doesn't seem so smart anymore. So to wrap up, when I think about learnings, I think back to that original retro and how we knew even back then, we had identified a real problem. It was a pain point. I think I can safely say that if you asked any engineer at Intent Media what the main pain point in tech was, for a period of several years, they would tell you it was problems with the build. So we somehow just couldn't get out of that. We were kind of stuck within our own dogma. So that's a lesson for me is, engineering teams and companies, startups in general, often start out with a strongly held belief that they go after, and it's awesome. And you just have to make sure to not get so stuck that you can't even, get outside that. So my radar has improved, at least in my opinion, very well. So when I found myself in other situations, I can see, like, is this not working in my opinion? Does everybody know this is not working? And are we doing something about it? Or are our efforts, having some degree of success? If not, let's step back and ask the fundamental questions, like, should we just shift gears entirely? So the last thing I would mention is that I think we all have a tendency to, when we see something that isn't working for us or that we're frustrated with, we have a tendency to think that it's that way because some higher power, whether it be your boss or your boss's boss or someone else, they like it that way, and they don't care that you don't like it that way. And my experience has actually been that that's really not true. There's certain things that help us believe that. A typical example is someone new comes into a company and says, this sucks. And someone who wrote that thing that sucks says, no, it doesn't, and that's, I worked hard on that. And then the first person feels, oh, well, I tried to do something and I was shut down. That's it. Now I'll just be frustrated for the rest of my life. So I'd like to encourage you all not to do that. I think that if we communicate well, we'll be able to get past these things and not get stuck and have happy times. So that's all I got. Thanks for listening. Yeah.
One or two questions. What I had to do was, as a manager, we learned about getting feedback.
Sorry, can you repeat? How do I get direct feedback? Is that what you're saying?
How do you learn to give effective feedback to members of your team?
Oh, give effective feedback. Yeah. It's interesting because I misheard you to maybe what I wanted to hear. I find it's much easier for me to give feedback than it is to get honest feedback. And I think that it's circular. So if I can establish a relationship with people where, I'm sure I'm listening to what their issues are, they're much more open to my ideas as well. So maybe sound like ducking the question, but that's my answer. Yeah.
I have a question about what you learned about how to design good tests from learning accuracy discipline, writing out your own tests. I think that you at some point decided that you didn't have some tests or from scratch. What did you learn about how to design tests that actually add value to your project?
Yeah, I think that if we had started again, we would have written those end-to-end tests differently, and there would have been many fewer of them. They would have been super happy path, but to keep the rigor in the unit test level, and there's also just a middle level where you're testing an individual service. So, You're testing the thing that someone is working on. One detail that I left out there was that when we declared bankruptcy, we left 3 tests in, just to make sure that the thing was wired up correctly, you know. And it took only less than 2 weeks, I think, before everyone was like, yeah, let's drop those 2. So I think for that company anyway, the right solution was that the good tests were one that were that related directly to the work that was being done. That means unit level and also up to the thing that you're releasing. And from there, we worked without automated testing. That was the solution for us. May not work for everyone. But yes?
Yeah, so just a clarifying question first. Who owned the build before the team? The micro team of 3 people together? Who owned the build?
Who owned the build? Well, when I started, I was engineer number 8, and as far as I know, everyone owned the build. There was no build team. In fact, the company never had a build team. The engineering team as a whole was, when I started, it was flat structure. Everyone was an equal. It was just part of the culture that I don't know whose idea it was to put it in the first place. But.
So in retrospect, do you think it was a good or a bad idea to have being responsible for the build versus like having sort of self-organizing responsibility?
So if I'm understanding your question, I mean, one thing that would be awesome is if a given team working on like a service or something like that was responsible for building their own stuff and determining the right level of testing to do for it. Yeah, then I'm with you 100%.
One thing I've encountered in the past is when there's a team responsible for the build, everybody else kind of just tosses stuff over the wall with the build, like what they want it to be, versus like testing themselves. So I've seen that pattern sometimes of saying, hey, this group of people are the people who own the build, and if something's wrong, it's their problem, it's not your problem.
Oh yeah, that's in general, that's something that that I've tried to avoid. That goes for other things, including deployment and as much as we can have, in my opinion, having a team that is responsible for producing features, responsible for everything about it. You have experts, a DevOps person maybe and things like that, but as much as you can contain that within the unit is what I've found to be most effective. I wasn't actually sure which side you were advocating for, but if you have another team or you have a QA team, for example, that you just say like, I'm done, now it's yours, that's to me been typically problematic, which sounded like what you were talking about.
It was an interesting reaction that the problem with building longer was to create a dedicated team. I was actually advocating sort of something opposite, which is,
right.
Hey, that can't create some anti-patterns of like stuffing across the wall or like, I don't know how the build works, this team knows how the build works, so I'm not going to bother.
Right, I get you.
Trying to make it better.
Right, so that dedicated team we created was a project. They didn't own the build. Their job was to get it slimmed down and address some of the problems. So it was temporary. So that lasted a couple of months, and then it was back to the team as well. So we definitely didn't create a build team as a way to solve the problem long term. Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming out.
Pleasure. Yeah. Thanks.